The morning I discovered I legally controlled the water of a 1940-acre lake. I assumed it would fix my life. What it actually did was put a target on my back. I was standing at the edge of the water just after sunrise, watching mist drift across the lake like slow-moving smoke, when a luxury SUV tore down my gravel road as if it owned the place. The tires stopped inches short of my old wooden dock, the one my family built generations ago, and out stepped a woman dressed like authority itself. Perfect posture, expensive sunglasses, clipboard held tight. "I'm Vanessa Hartwell, president of the Lakeshore Ridge Association," she said, already writing before I'd spoken a word. "This structure is non-compliant. You'll need to remove it within 30 days. Also, there's a mandatory monthly lake usage assessment, $700. For a second, I genuinely thought she was joking. "You're charging me," I said slowly, pointing at the water behind her, "to use a lake that came with my inheritance?" She didn't even blink. "The lake is considered a shared community resource. All shoreline owners are subject to association oversight." That's when I realized something important. She had no idea what I actually owned. 6 weeks earlier, I was just Daniel Cross, 43, freshly divorced, trying to rebuild a life that felt like it had been knocked sideways. I'd left a technical career, downsized into a small rental, and convinced myself I was starting over. Then my great-aunt passed away, and I got a call from a law office I didn't even know existed. That meeting changed everything. Buried in a stack of documents older than most of the town was a deed granting my family not just land, but water rights, depth control, and shoreline authority over nearly 2,000 acres of freshwater. Rights written long before zoning boards, HOAs, or laminated rule books. Back on the dock, Vanessa slapped a fluorescent notice onto my truck windshield like a threat wrapped in paper. "Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action," she said, already turning away. I peeled the notice off once she was gone. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Over the next hour, neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, pretending not to stare. I could feel it, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was I the next one they'd break? What Vanessa didn't realize was that I wasn't clueless, desperate, or isolated. I'd spent years reading contracts, solving structural problems, and dealing with systems that relied on intimidation instead of logic. And now she'd made her move before understanding mine. As the sun climbed higher over the lake, I folded the notice carefully and slid it into my pocket, not as a warning, but as evidence. I didn't know it yet, but that single piece of paper would end up exposing far more than a dock violation, and it would be the first crack in her carefully built control. By the end of that week, the quiet lake I just inherited turned into a battlefield made entirely of envelopes, deadlines, and threats printed in bold ink. The first letter arrived by certified mail, then another, and another, each one more aggressive than the last. Structural inspection demands, environmental reviews, administrative processing fees I'd never agreed to. Every page ended the same way: failure to comply would trigger daily penalties. It was obvious what Vanessa Hartwell was doing. She wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to exhaust me before I understood the game. I spread the letters across my kitchen counter that night, rereading them slowly. The language was intentionally dense, packed with references to bylaws and subsections meant to intimidate, not inform. Anyone unfamiliar with legal paperwork would panic. Anyone already struggling would cave. That's when I decided to stop reacting and start verifying. 2 days later, I found myself in the lowest level of the county records building, a place that smelled like dust, toner, and forgotten arguments. Rows of metal shelves stretched farther than seemed reasonable, each packed with documents no one bothered to question anymore. I requested every historical filing tied to my property. Hours passed. Then something clicked. There it was, the original transfer record tied to my family's name. Not amended, not superseded, not overridden. The document outlined rights extending beneath the lakebed itself, granting control over water usage, shoreline access, and long-term stewardship across what was now measured at 1940 acres. More importantly, the language predated every authority Vanessa was citing. The association didn't override my rights. My rights existed outside of them. Driving home, the lake looked different, not just peaceful, but grounded. Stable, like it had outlasted every attempt to control it from the outside. The modern homes lining the shoreline suddenly felt temporary, built on assumptions no one had bothered to test. That evening, an older woman introduced herself while I was checking the dock supports. Ruth Calder, 76, lived 2 houses down and had been there longer than the association itself. "She's done this before," Ruth said quietly. "Targets people one at a time, pushes until they sell or leave. No one ever fights back." That explained the looks I'd been getting. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Mandatory association meeting special session attendance required I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Emergency meetings weren't about governance. They were about control. And control only tightened when it started slipping. I locked my phone, poured a cup of coffee, and opened my folder of documents again. This time not with frustration, but focus. Because if they were rushing this hard, it meant they were afraid of something. And fear, when mixed with authority, always led to mistakes. As I circled the meeting date on my calendar, one thought stayed with me. If they wanted this settled quietly, they wouldn't be dragging everyone into the room. The moment I walked into that emergency meeting, I knew this wasn't about rules. It was about putting on a show before anyone could ask the wrong questions. The community hall was packed tighter than I expected. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air thick with stale coffee and nervous murmurs. People avoided eye contact the way you do when you don't want to be involved, but can't look away either. At the front of the room stood Vanessa Hartwell, perfectly composed, flanked by a handful of board members who looked like they'd memorized their talking points, but not much else. A projector hummed behind her, already displaying grainy photos of my dock from awkward angles. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "We're facing a serious compliance issue that threatens both safety and property values." There it was, fear wrapped in professionalism. She clicked to the next slide, highlighted sections of association guidelines, arrows pointing dramatically toward my property. According to her presentation, my dock was outdated, environmentally questionable, and part of a broader pattern of non-compliance that could, not would, could lead to liability for everyone. That's when I stood up. "Before this goes any further," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I think it's important we talk about jurisdiction." The room went quiet in a way that made every cough sound louder than it should have. Vanessa's smile tightened. "This meeting isn't the place for individual disputes," she replied quickly. "I disagree," I said, "especially when fees, penalties, and enforcement are being discussed." I held up a folder, not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough for people to notice. "The property I inherited includes documented water rights covering approximately 1940 acres, established long before this association existed." Murmurs rippled through the room. One board member leaned toward another, whispering. Someone in the back asked, "Is that true?" Vanessa straightened. Those documents are outdated and irrelevant. The association has recognized oversight over properties that fall under its authority, I finished. Mine doesn't. I didn't argue further. I didn't raise my voice. I simply sat back down. That was the moment I saw it, the crack, not anger, not outrage, uncertainty. The meeting ended abruptly after that. No vote, no resolution. Just a vague promise of further review and a rushed adjournment that felt more like retreat than closure. As people filed out, a few neighbors slowed near me. One nodded. Another quietly said, "About time someone said something." Outside, the air felt lighter. Vanessa didn't look at me as she left, but I could tell she was recalculating. This wasn't the clean takedown she'd planned. This was resistance, and resistance spreads. I drove home under a darkening sky, the lake reflecting the first stars of the evening, calm as ever. And for the first time since inheriting it, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my dock anymore. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again, and the message made it clear she wasn't backing down, she was doubling down. I woke up the next morning to the sound of engines outside my house. And that's when I realized the HOA had stopped pretending and started weaponizing bureaucracy. Through the window, I counted 3 official-looking vehicles parked along my driveway. Clipboards, reflective vests, the whole production. If intimidation had a uniform, this was it. By the time I stepped outside, they were already at work. A building inspector paced along the dock, measuring tape snapping open and shut. An environmental officer knelt near the shoreline, collecting water samples with exaggerated care. A third official hovered near the septic area, poking at the ground like he expected something to explode. "We've received multiple complaints," one of them explained, not unkindly. "We're required to investigate anonymous complaints." Of course, I nodded and said nothing, pulling out my phone and documenting everything. Timestamps, faces, vehicle numbers. Years of dealing with systems had taught me one thing. If someone sends officials after you, you make sure there's a record. They spent hours combing my property, and the longer they stayed, the more uncomfortable they seemed. Finally, the building inspector, his name tag read Elliot, wiped his forehead and walked over. "Off the record," he said quietly, "this dock meets current safety standards better than most we see." The environmental officer confirmed the same. No contamination, no disruption, no violations. In other words, nothing Vanessa had accused me of actually existed. That afternoon, a patrol car slowed near the property. The deputy stepped out, glanced at the vehicles, then at me. "Getting popular," he said. I showed him the notices. The repeated complaints, the timing, he raised an eyebrow. "Funny thing," he said, "all those reports came from the same contact number." That wasn't enforcement, that was harassment. By evening, the officials were gone, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and an awkward silence. I sat on the dock as the sun dipped low over the 1940-acre lake, watching the water settle back into its usual rhythm. That's when my phone rang. It was Marcus Hale, a junior attorney a neighbor had recommended. Young, sharp, and curious enough to actually read historical records. "What you have," he said after reviewing the documents, "is leverage. Real leverage." He explained it plainly. The association had no authority over pre-existing water rights. Their enforcement actions weren't just invalid, they were risky. Every fine, every notice, every forced inspection could become evidence, especially if it showed a pattern. "People like this don't stop," Marcus added. "They escalate, and when they do, they usually cross a line they can't walk back." I hung up and looked out over the lake again. Vanessa Hartwell thought she was tightening control. What she didn't realize was that every move she made was documenting her own overreach. and systems that rely on pressure tend to collapse the moment pressure is applied back. As night settled in, another notification lit up my phone, and this one made it clear she wasn't just escalating, she was getting careless. The next notice didn't come by mail, it came as a threat disguised as policy, and that's when I knew she'd crossed from aggressive into reckless. The email subject line read, "Immediate compliance required." Inside was a neatly formatted document outlining updated lake governance measures. According to the association, new emergency rules were now in effect. Temporary access restrictions, revised usage standards, and a warning that any noncompliance could result in liens against affected properties. Liens, I read it twice, then a third time just to be sure I wasn't missing something. They were attempting to claim financial authority over land and water they had no jurisdiction over, and they were doing it in writing. That kind of mistake usually comes from panic. I forwarded the email to Marcus immediately. He called within minutes. "She just did you a favor," he said, not even trying to hide the excitement. "Threatening liens without authority isn't just invalid, it's actionable." That afternoon, we met at my kitchen table, documents spread out between coffee mugs and notepads. Marcus pointed to a survey map I hadn't paid much attention to before, tracing a finger along the shoreline. "See this boundary?" he asked. "It doesn't stop where the association thinks it does." The realization hit me slowly. A portion of the association's own infrastructure, dock extensions, shoreline landscaping, even a private boat platform, sat on land still legally tied to my family's original water grant. Not leased, not permitted, just assumed. "They've been using it for years," Marcus continued, "which means they've been trespassing." The irony was almost impressive. As if on cue, a neighbor stopped by, Harold Jensen, retired, cautious, and clearly uncomfortable speaking too loudly. He told me the association had been quietly increasing fees, redirecting funds, and approving expenditures without full votes. "Most people don't look," he said. "They trust the board." That trust was starting to crack. By evening, word had spread faster than I expected. A few residents messaged me privately, asking questions, comparing notices, noticing patterns they'd ignored before, and then Vanessa made her next move. Another email, this time announcing a special vote scheduled for the following week. The agenda was vague but ominous, filled with language about protecting shared resources and temporary authority adjustments. It was a bluff, and a loud one. I stood on the dock as the sun sank low, the water of the 1940-acre lake reflecting gold and shadow in equal measure. Everything about the place felt steady, unmoved, patient. Vanessa Hartwell was scrambling to control something she never owned. And the more she pushed, the clearer it became, to me and now to others, that this wasn't about safety or fairness. It was about power slipping through her fingers. As I read the meeting agenda again, one thing stood out. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was daring someone to stop her. When the agenda for that special vote finally circulated, it became obvious Vanessa wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to force the outcome before anyone could catch up. The document was packed with polished language and vague urgency. Phrases like temporary stewardship authority, emergency resource protection, and community stabilization measures appeared over and over, never quite explaining what they meant, but sounding serious enough to scare people into silence. Marcus and I went through it line by line. "She's setting this up so most residents won't understand what they're voting on," he said. "If it passes, she'll claim implied consent." Implied consent. The favorite tool of people who don't actually have authority. That afternoon, I took a slow drive around the 1940-acre lake. stopping at a few properties I'd been told were quietly frustrated with the association. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I just asked questions, and people talked. They talked about unexplained fee increases, about enforcement letters that appeared after disagreements, about requests for financial transparency that were brushed aside or delayed indefinitely. One couple mentioned a dock repair they'd been forced to undo, only to see the same design approved for a board member months later. Patterns always reveal themselves when you stop ignoring them. By evening, Marcus had uncovered something even more troubling. Public financial filings showed large sums categorized as consulting and administrative review, approved without detailed disclosure. Not illegal on its own, but suspicious, especially paired with the sudden urgency of this vote. Whatever she's protecting, Marcus said, tapping the page, it's not the community. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't just my issue anymore. The association's behavior was affecting everyone around the lake, whether they realized it yet or not. The meeting was held in the same community hall, but the atmosphere had changed. People whispered openly now. Groups clustered instead of sitting alone. Someone had brought printed copies of the agenda and was passing them around, highlighting sections that raised questions. Vanessa noticed. Her presentation was sharper than before, faster, less room for interruption. She spoke about liability, about outside threats, about how unity required decisive action. And then she made the mistake she couldn't undo. She claimed the association had the authority to manage water access across the entire lake during emergency conditions. I stood up, calmly, clearly. "And who defines an emergency?" I asked. "And under what legal authority?" Silence. She answered anyway, too quickly, too defensively, citing policies that didn't apply, referring to powers the association simply didn't have. The room shifted, not dramatically, subtly. The way trust erodes when people realize they've been relying on confidence instead of truth. As the meeting adjourned without a vote, again, I knew something fundamental had changed. Vanessa wasn't leading anymore. She was being watched. As people filed out, one resident stopped beside me and whispered 5 words that confirmed it all. "We need to see the books." The moment someone whispered, "We need to see the books," the entire situation shifted from a personal dispute into something much bigger and far more dangerous for the HOA leadership. That single sentence spread faster than any email the association had ever sent. Within days, residents started comparing notes, not publicly, yet, but quietly. Messages bounced between neighbors who had barely spoken before. Screenshots of fee increases, copies of enforcement notices, dates that didn't line up. Patterns started forming. Marcus called me one evening, his voice tighter than usual. "I pulled additional public filings," he said. "There are discrepancies, not criminal on their own, but combined with selective enforcement. It's a problem." He explained that certain expenditures labeled as emergency consulting appeared repeatedly, always approved without detailed explanation. The timing lined up almost perfectly with enforcement actions against specific homeowners, people who questioned decisions, requested records, or simply didn't fall in line. Pressure wasn't the tool anymore. Exposure was. Meanwhile, Vanessa went silent. No emails, no notices, no public statements. That kind of silence doesn't mean calm, it means planning. 2 nights later, a car idled near my driveway longer than necessary. No confrontation. No approach, just presence, enough to be noticed. I documented it anyway. The next morning, Marcus confirmed what we'd suspected. The association had retained outside advisors quietly. No member vote, no announcement. That alone wasn't unusual. doing it while actively avoiding transparency was. "They're preparing for fallout," he said. "People do that when they expect questions they can't answer." That afternoon, I walked the shoreline again, letting the calm of the 1940-acre lake steady my thoughts. The water didn't care about meetings or bylaws. It existed long before any of this, and it would exist long after. By evening, the association finally spoke. A notice appeared announcing an annual meeting moved up by 3 months, citing organizational necessity. Buried near the bottom was a line about a financial overview, optional attendance, no public comment period listed. Optional, convenient. Marcus smiled when he read it. "That's not a meeting," he said. "That's a stall." But stalls only work if no one pushes. Over the next week, residents started formally requesting records, perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable, and suddenly the association's response time slowed to a crawl. Delays, excuses, redirects. Vanessa, once so confident, now avoided direct communication entirely. That's when the final piece fell into place. A resident forwarded me an internal memo, accidentally sent, apparently referencing risk mitigation, exposure limitation, and leadership continuity planning. Continuity planning. For leadership that wasn't elected again yet. I sat back and exhaled slowly. This had never been about docs, fees, or compliance. It was about control and the fear of losing it. And fear, when backed into a corner, always makes one last mistake. As the date of the rushed annual meeting approached, I realized this wasn't going to end quietly. It was going to end publicly. The night of the rushed annual meeting felt different, not tense, not chaotic, but charged, like everyone in the room knew something irreversible was about to happen. The community hall was full well before the scheduled start time. Not the usual handful of regulars, but nearly every homeowner around the 1940-acre lake. People stood along the walls. Others leaned against doorframes. Conversations were low, deliberate, and focused. Vanessa Hartwell arrived last. She walked in with the same polished confidence she always wore, but it didn't land the way it used to. Too many eyes followed her. Too many people were no longer willing to look away. The meeting opened with routine formalities, approvals, acknowledgments, scripted statements meant to burn time. Then came the financial overview. Vanessa spoke quickly, summarizing numbers without detail, pointing to charts that looked impressive until you noticed what they didn't show. No breakdowns, no explanations, just totals and assurances. That's when Marcus stood up. "Before we move on," he said calmly, "several members have formally requested access to detailed financial records under state association law. Those requests haven't been fulfilled." The room went quiet. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Those records are being reviewed," she said. "This isn't the appropriate forum." "It is," another resident interrupted. Then another. And another. Voices joined in, not shouting, not angry, just firm. People asking for clarity, for transparency, for answers they'd been denied for years. Vanessa tried to regain control. She called for order. She threatened to adjourn. But the momentum had shifted too far. Someone asked about consulting expenses. Someone else asked why enforcement actions targeted the same households repeatedly. Then a resident near the front asked the question no one could ignore anymore. Why were association funds used to address issues on property the HOA doesn't control? That's when Vanessa's composure finally cracked. She deflected. She redirected. She blamed misunderstandings. But explanations don't work when trust is already gone. Marcus placed a printed request on the front table, citing the exact statute requiring disclosure. "We're not accusing," he said evenly. "We're asking to see the records." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. After a long pause, Vanessa adjourned the meeting without a vote. That was the moment everyone understood. If there was nothing to hide, she wouldn't be running. Outside, small groups gathered under the parking lot lights, voices animated now, energized. Phone numbers were exchanged. Plans were discussed. People who'd been isolated before realized they weren't alone. I stood back, listening. This wasn't a victory yet, but it was something just as important: awareness. And awareness has a way of unraveling systems built on intimidation. As I drove home, the lake lay still beneath the moonlight, reflecting it perfectly. Unmoved. Patient, certain. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be handled behind closed doors anymore. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a message that made it clear. Someone inside the association had finally decided to talk. The message on my phone was only 4 words long, but it carried more weight than every threat that came before it. We need to meet. Privately. The sender was a board member I barely knew, not outspoken, not confrontational. The kind of person who usually survived by staying quiet. We agreed to meet the next morning at a small cafe just outside the neighborhood, far enough away to avoid curious eyes. They arrived early, hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup they hadn't touched. "I can't keep pretending anymore," they said after a long pause. "Things aren't right." What followed wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was worse, methodical. A pattern of rushed approvals, expenses pushed through under emergency authority, decisions framed as urgent so no one would slow them down with questions, every concern dismissed as obstruction. "And the lake?" I asked. They exhaled slowly. "That's the pressure point. Everything revolves around control of access. Without it, certain plans don't work." They wouldn't name names. They didn't have to. Later that day, Marcus reviewed the information and nodded once. "This fills the gaps," he said. "Not accusations, confirmation." Word spread quickly after that, but not chaotically. Calmly, purposefully, requests for a formal audit were submitted. A petition circulated calling for an independent review of governance and finances. This time, it wasn't just a few voices, it was a majority. Vanessa tried to respond with another email. Short, defensive, vague reassurances about cooperation and transparency, moving forward. It was too late. The association's legal counsel, new, unfamiliar, sent a notice announcing a temporary pause on enforcement actions pending review. That single sentence said more than any apology could. I walked the shoreline that evening, the water of the 1940-acre lake smooth and reflective, catching the colors of sunset like it always had. Nothing about it had changed, but everything around it had. Neighbors waved now. Some stopped to talk openly. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors were happening out in the open. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. The final notice came a week later. A special election would be held. Oversight would be present. Financial records would be released in full. Vanessa Hartwell's name was still on the agenda, but not in the way she'd planned. I sat on the dock as dusk settled in, thinking about how easily authority can be mistaken for legitimacy. How long people will tolerate pressure if they believe they're alone, and how fast that changes once they realize they're not. As the election date approached, one thing was clear. Whatever happened next would decide not just leadership, but who truly controlled the future of the lake. The final vote didn't come with shouting or drama. It arrived quietly, the way real change usually does, and by the time it ended, everything was different. The special election was held on a clear Saturday morning. No rushed agenda. No vague language. Independent oversight sat at the front of the room, documents neatly stacked, procedures explained line by line. For the first time since I'd arrived, the association operated in daylight. Ballots were counted carefully. When the results were announced, there was no applause, just a collective exhale. Vanessa Hartwell was removed from leadership by a decisive margin. Interim board members were appointed immediately, and the first motion they passed was full financial disclosure and a permanent suspension of enforcement actions tied to disputed authority. No speeches, no excuses, just accountability. Over the following weeks, records were released, policies rewritten, and controls put in place to prevent the same concentration of power from happening again. Residents who'd once avoided meetings now volunteered for committees. Conversations shifted from fear to planning. The lake remained unchanged, calm, steady, patient. I spent more time on the dock during those weeks than I had in years, watching families return to the shoreline without worrying about notices or fines. Kids skipped stones across the water. Kayaks drifted past at sunset. The 1940-acre lake felt like what it was always meant to be, a shared place, not a leverage point. One evening, as the light faded and the water mirrored the sky, it hit me how close this all came to going the other way. How easily pressure can become normal if no one challenges it. How systems built on intimidation survive only as long as silence does. This was never about winning. It was about stopping something wrong before it became permanent. The dock still stands. The water still flows. And now the rules are finally grounded in reality instead of fear. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that authority should always be questioned, and documentation matters more than confidence ever will. Before you go, I want to say this. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that pushed too far, or a situation where power was used instead of earned, you're not alone. Thanks for watching. If you found this story helpful or relatable, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below. I'd genuinely love to hear what you think or what you've experienced.